Hi, I am Praveen Malik, and welcome to my presentation on the emergence of quaternary-based computational strata from a symmetrical multi-layered model of light. This presentation has been prepared for the UK SIM AMSS 24th International Conference on Modeling and Simulation to be held at Emmanuel College at University of Cambridge. A brief overview of what I intend to go over in the next 20 minutes. First, I will introduce the core quantum computational model of light that is proposed to be a generator of computational strata at different levels of existence. I will then go over how such strata is computational strata at the level of the electromagnetic spectrum, at the level of quantum particles that emerge subsequently, at the level of atoms, and at the level of cells. And finally, I'll offer a summary and conclusion. So at the heart of this approach is this quantum computational model of light, and this is captured in this light matrix. This light matrix is made up of several layers. So the native state of light is imagined to be a conceptual space where light travels infinitely fast. And since it travels infinitely fast, it will be present in whatever volume is considered and therefore exhibit a property of presence. If anything not of the nature of light arises, that will be overpowered by light sooner or later, and therefore a property of power arises. Since anything that appears or disappears will be recorded in the substance of light, the light therefore has a knowledge of everything that's happening in its space or volume, and therefore a property of knowledge arises. And since everything is intimately connected in the fabric of light, there's an implicit property of harmony that also arises. So this initial fourfoldness then creates a symmetrical model whereby as light is projected at slower speeds through an act of quantization, so the quantizations of which there are three are represented by these rows bound by parentheses. And essentially what this is saying is that the next layer of light is a function, a symmetrical expression of the initial layer of light. And here what we see is because of quantization, there's essentially a bringing out of what is meant by these four properties that we call presence, power, knowledge, harmony. So essentially, the property of presence becomes a large set of presence that has elements all related to presence. Similarly, the property of power gets differentiated into a set for power. The property of knowledge gets differentiated into a set of knowledge. And the property of harmony gets differentiated into a set of harmony. Now, due to a further quantization, so light being projected at an even slower speed, and while I've written extensively about the quote-unquote physics of this, where light at a slower speed, remaining constant at a level, will impact a number of other constants, or another constants will, in a sense, be dependent on this value of the speed of light. And there is an effect on materialization. And so due to this act of quantization, we find that another conceptual space is created whereby a further differentiation becomes apparent. And in this differentiation, there's a subtle materialization where the elements in these large, practically infinite sets can combine together in unique ways to essentially create a vast number of unique subtle seeds. And that's what's represented as a reality at this layer of light. Now, due to a final act of quantization, these subtle seeds that exist in large number getting materialized require some arena in which to exist. And that arena we can think of as space, which is represented by S. The maturity of these subtle seeds so that they display eventually the secret inside them happens through a process of time. The time is relative, and this is represented by T. There's an energy, an essential energy that will accompany this transformation from the subtlety to the more material aspect of the seed, and that's represented by E. And then finally, there will be some implicit collaboration or coordination or arrangement between seed and seed and seeds and seeds, and that we may refer to as gravity. Therefore, when light is projected at speed c, what this model is saying is that initiates the macro parameters of space-time energy gravity as we understand it. And we can also think of this event of the subtle becoming more material as being associated with what we may call the Big Bang, but that's just a side note that you may find of interest. Now, this matrix is obviously, because it has several layers of quantization, there's a persistent, one can think of a persistent quantum computation that's taking place, whereby the infinity of information that exists in antecedent layers of light is, in a sense, vying for materialization or becoming material due to various dynamics. And again, we don't have the time to go into that, but I've explored those in other papers. But as a result of this quantum computation, there's a generation of computational strata, and that's what I'm going to go into in the remaining presentation. And we can think of these subsequent layers that arise within space-time energy gravity of the electromagnetic spectrum, of quantum particles, of atoms, of cells, as all being displays of this computational strata. And I'm going to go over why this is computational strata. Now, there may be other things that arise, but that is also outside the bounds of this paper. So coming right into the electromagnetic field-based computational stratum, when we think of the electromagnetic field, the essential correlation that we must draw out is how the electromagnetic field would express the four properties in this quantum computational model of light that we called knowledge, power, harmony, and presence. And here there's a mapping proposed whereby the range of wavelengths implicit in the electromagnetic spectrum, which therefore suggests an archetype of many different possibilities of behavior as being or being the vehicle for what we may call light's property of knowledge. Now, we know that as wavelength changes, so we have an infinite number of wavelengths in the electromagnetic spectrum. As they change, their frequency is going to be correlated and change as well. And the higher the frequency, the higher the power, and therefore there's an implicit energy gradient. And so we may say that a frequency in that sense becomes a vehicle for light's property of power. Now, we already went over the precipitation of different speeds of light, constant speeds. And so the speed c creates a layer in which space-time energy gravity can arise, and the entire play of matter arises. And therefore, there is this implicit harmony that's created when the electromagnetic spectrum travels at this speed c. And finally, there is a potential for a mass that's implicit in the electromagnetic spectrum. And therefore, this potential for mass is suggested to be the carrier of light's property of presence. So we find that the electromagnetic spectrum has or can express this fourness, which is integral and implicit in light, and therefore this fourness becoming explicit in this material manifestation is a prerequisite for any strata to be sustainable, and therefore the electromagnetic spectrum can be thought of as a sustainable stratum. And this point just summarizes what I said, that the implicit and integrated properties within light becoming explicit maintain that integrality, and set up what can be thought of as strata stability. Now, concisely, this just summarizes, these mathematical notations just summarize what I had explained above, which is how knowledge, power, harmony, and presence correlate with the properties of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this leads us into the notion of, therefore, the strata, the stable strata, potentially becoming computational strata or a computational stratum. So we will find that if for anything to become computational stratum, it must have the ability to house memory, to create logical gates, and to have a vast potential functionality. So the ability to house memory becomes clear from the arising of many potential stable states manifest as different frequencies or wavelengths of light. And these can be changed from one stable state to another, and therefore there arises the possibility of housing memory. If we think about constructive and destructive interference of waves, then these may be leveraged to become the basis of logical gates. And if we think, going back to the quantum computational model of light, in an antecedent layer, we had the expression of an infinite number of infinite seeds, and the way that this would materialize within the electromagnetic spectrum is essentially through the interaction of some primary element X and secondary element Y that can be repeated multiple times, but the weight of X is higher than the weight of Y, and essentially would leverage some essential element from these four sets that now we have the basis of, from thinking about the correlation over here of knowledge, power, harmony, and presence to the electromagnetic spectrum. So we therefore have this ability for memory to arise, for logical gates to be created, and for infinite number or a large number of unique seeds and functional states. And therefore, we may say that this stable stratum can become computational stratum. So now moving more quickly through the next few layers, when we think about quantum particles following a similar logic, we may say that we have quarks, leptons, bosons, and the Higgs boson, which classify all quantum particles. So there's four categories. And over here, what is proposed is that quarks is a carrier of knowledge, of light's property of knowledge. Essentially, how does this work? Because if we think about atomic number that uniquely defines an element or atom, that atomic number is contributed to by the nucleus, the number of protons in the nucleus, and we know that protons are entirely made from quarks, and therefore quarks in this thinking becomes a carrier for knowledge. Similarly, if we think about leptons and using electrons as a surrogate for the lepton class, we know that electrons are associated with the flow of energy and power. And therefore, we may say that the lepton is a carrier for light's property of power. When we think about bosons, these can be thought of as force carriers and essentially are required for all quantum particles to interact and to come together. And therefore, bosons can be thought of as a carrier of light's property of harmony. When we think about the creation of matter, then the majority of mass of an atom resides in the nucleus, and it is the quarks that essentially, through interaction with the Higgs field, accumulate mass, and therefore the Higgs boson associated with the Higgs field can be thought of as the mass giver or the carrier of light's property of presence. Therefore, again, we find that these four properties implicit in light become explicit and maintain their integrality as quarks, leptons, bosons, and Higgs boson, and therefore the layer of quantum particles can become a stable strata. And if, again, we can organize this or manipulate these quantum particles so that memory, logical gates and unique functionality arises, then quantum particles can also become computational stratum. And here, what is proposed is that essentially thinking about memory, this may operate through the action of electrons in an atom. So if you have an electron in a particular orbit around an atom, it represents one memory state. And if it switches to another orbit, it then represents another memory state. And this flipping can take place. And therefore, you have the possibility of memory that can be created through this functioning of electrons. Now, when we think about gates, then essentially, we can think about this as constructed through combinations of orbits of atoms and the actions of photons to flip the status of the gates to therefore implement broader functionality. So this also allows the potentiality of the creation of logical gates. And when we think about unique functionality, let me just draw on the equation that I had used earlier that emanates from, or the seed of that is essentially the antecedent layer, which houses infinite number of possible seeds. But if we think about just seeds related to leptons, then using the same primary formula of X being the more heavily weighted state and Y that can occur many times as a less weighted state, and X over here deriving from the set of power, which is related to leptons, and Y deriving from elements from any of the other sets, then we have the basis of a large unique functionality that can also be created. And therefore, this layer becomes also computational stratum. So moving through the atom level, I'll quickly go through this, but essentially, we have all atoms that can be classified as P group, D group, S group, and F group atoms. So if we basically think of P group atoms, then we find a representation of many kinds of elements, such as metals, metalloids, non-metals, halogens, noble gas, and so on. And so in some sense, this category really houses many different archetypes. And therefore, this category can be thought of as a carrier of Light's property of knowledge. When we think of a D group, this comprises transition metals that are essentially workhorse metals, create all the infrastructure we know around us, and therefore, we can think of this as a carrier of Light's property of presence. When we think about the S group, we have essentially alkali metals and alkali earth metals, and an example of this is hydrogen and helium, that we know, for example, powers all the stars in the universe. And so we already see some correlation between this group and Light's property of power. And essentially F group that comprises lanthanides and actinides that are the largest atoms due to their larger atomic numbers. We find, in a sense, experimentations in collectivity, stable collectivity in lanthanides and potentially unstable collectivities due to radioactivity in actinides. But essentially, this group is therefore considered to be a precipitation or carrier of Light's property of harmony. And again, this notation is represented succinctly by these four formulas. Memory can be conceived as a reversible reaction in which a particular atom in a molecular conglomerate having dominance switches to some other, and therefore this becomes the basis of memory and the flipping of memory. Logical gates may be formed by different groups of atoms that will react in predictable ways under the influence of the same stimulus. And so we have the basis of logical gates. And then similarly, we have the basis of a large functionality. And here, just taking the lanthanide group, we can see a number of different functionality that may arise due to the same formula. And therefore, we have this stable strata or stratum of atoms that can become computational stratum as well. Lastly, when we think about the cells, and we know that each cell has four molecular plans, which we know as nucleic acids, proteins, lipids, and polysaccharides. We know that nucleic acids basically encode information. They're a carrier of knowledge in the cell. And so we can say that they are basically the keepers or an expression of light's property of knowledge. Proteins can be thought of as the cell's workhorses and therefore are a precipitation of light's property of presence. Lipids that are tiny molecules, but when grouped together can form large structures in the cell, essentially create natural compartmentalization and therefore set up the basis of harmony. And polysaccharides that are long branch chains of sugar molecules can be thought of as storage containers and also repositories of energy, and therefore carrier of a light's property of power. So we have, again, the basis of a stable strata, because what's implicit in light becomes explicit and maintains its integrality. And now we can see also that memory, logical gates, and unique functionality can also be expressed at the level of cells. So we have myriad types of cellular proteins that can exist in one or more stable states, and it's possible to flip these between these states, and therefore we have the basis of memory. We have the basis of logical gates, again, due to the action of proteins that can react in a predictable way under the influence of some stimulus. And we have, just taking the category of proteins, we know, for example, in any living cell, there's over 30,000 different proteins. In particular, in a human cell, there's over 30,000 different proteins, and therefore there's large functionality that exists there. So again, we have stable strata becoming computational strata. So coming to summary and conclusion, light itself can be perceived as a generator of quaternary-based strata. This strata is afforded stability, just summarizing, because the implicit fourfoldness in light seeks integrality when projected explicitly, and so long as a particular strata allows that integrality to exist, which we saw in the case of the electromagnetic spectrum, quantum particles, atoms, and cells, then you have the basis of computational strata that can be created due to the actions of memory, logical gates, and universal functionality. And essentially also there's a different object of computation and innate creativity that becomes apparent when we see the large number of unique functionality that can exist at any of these layers that we went over. And this also suggests an alternative interpretation to quantum level phenomena and an alternative approach to quantum computation. Fifth, as a result of this persistent quantum computation that's taking place due to the action of the light matrix, there's always information that's being created, and this is genetic type information and also sheds insight into the structure and possibilities of genetics itself. Sixth, in the emergence of space-time energy gravity, we can understand this to be a fourfold script that's required or recorded in a space-time energy gravity fabric. And it can be thought of as the very substance of what's happening at the quantum level and the very language of all genetic type information as well. Again, I've explored this in some detail elsewhere, but I just wanted to draw this out as a conclusion. Seventh, any process of artificial intelligence would need to consider the generation of such quaternary-based computational strata. Otherwise, it becomes severely limited in scope. And finally, since we have the phenomena or the technologies towards transhumanism that are growing in importance today, then the point here is that the deep understanding of a symmetrical light-based model and its generation of quaternary-based computational strata would also be required to really allow the field of transhumanism to come to fruition. So with that, I would like to end and thank you, and I will welcome any questions. Thank you.